Hello and welcome to part 3 of the Cambrian explosion. So let's think about why did this happen? Why did the Cambrian explosion happen at this point in Earth history? And what were the factors that led to it happening? So again, here is our phylogeny of the animals indicating this massive rise in the diversity of fossils at the beginning of the Cambrian period. And one of the things that set the stage for this evolutionary story were these series of snowball Earth events that started happening in what we call the Cryogenian period around 700 million years ago. So right before the Ediacaran period. And fun fact that there's actually very good evidence that these snowball Earth events happened in the rocks here in Utah. So if you go up to the mineral forkitillite, you can see what are called drop stones. So these are stones that were literally dropped from a receding glacier into a pile of ocean sediment where it was preserved. So geologists have shown that the way these drop stones are formed is that a glacier grows out into a marine environment, and then as it melts, it leaves the stones that were in the glaciers behind, and they drop into the ocean. And with more work, geologists were able to show that many of these drop stones were formed at the equator, which means there were glaciers at the equator dropping stones into ocean sediment. And that's what the mineral forkitillite is. So let's think about what was going on just after these snowball Earth events occurred. So as the snowball was thawing, you get another rise in oxygen, which is what this figure is showing here. So just before the appearance of animals, just before the Cambrian explosion, and also just before the appearance of multicellular algae, and then land plants and fungi came later on, you get this another big rise in the concentration of oxygen. So earlier in the course, we spent a lot of time talking about this first big great oxidation event, where oxygen went from basically 0 to more than 10% of the amount of oxygen that we have today. And now we're talking about a second major great oxidation event, where the amount of oxygen went from about 10% of what we have today to 100% of what we have today. That is about the same amount of oxygen that we have now. Earlier in the course, we had already jumped to this other little blip in the amount of oxygen. That was the Carboniferous period that came about because of the evolution of land plants. So now we're going backwards just a little bit to talk about the origin of animals after we'd already talked about the early evolution of plants. So during this time, just before the rise of animals, before the Cambrian period, you get this another big rise in oxygen. A big rise in oxygen is accompanied by a drop in CO2, carbon dioxide, which is not shown in this figure. But as we have learned in this course, the concentrations of oxygen and the concentrations of carbon dioxide are almost always coupled. So a rise in oxygen, it makes sense, you'd have a drop in carbon dioxide. A drop in carbon dioxide means less carbonic acid in the ocean. So less carbon dioxide means less acid in the ocean, which means the pH is higher. The pH is more alkaline. Earlier in the course, we had talked about how today the amount of CO2 is going up because of human activity, which is adding acid to the oceans and dropping the pH of the ocean. So during this time, after the snowball Earth, the opposite is happening. Carbon dioxide is dropping, acid is dropping, the pH in the ocean goes up. At the same time, you have erosion of these newly ice-free continents. So the continents have been underneath these huge layers of ice during the snowball Earth. When the snowball Earth ends, the ice recedes, opening up all of this rock on the continents, which can be weathered by rain and wind, and the minerals and nutrients locked up in those rocks on the continents can now be brought out into the ocean, and the ocean is now with a higher pH. So putting all these things together into a story listed in these bullet points, which is our first big reason of what sparked the Cambrian explosion, we'll be filling out the other parts of the story in later videos. But for now, we're focusing on this first one, which is the change in environmental conditions brought about by the end of the snowball Earth episodes. So as I was just talking about, you had this increased rate of erosion of the continents. During glacial melting and after the glaciers were gone, led to increased availability of nutrients and minerals from those continents flowing out into the ocean due to weathering. So this increase in nutrients and minerals in the ocean led to an explosion of algae, especially in coastal environments, that must have made the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere rise even higher, so accelerating the rise in oxygen that was probably already occurring. And also the combination of the higher pH of the ocean and also increased nutrients and minerals coming from the continents means that there was more dissolved calcium available in the oceans, and those two things together, the calcium and the pH, must have made making shells, which are made out of calcium carbonate, much more favorable to these new animals of the Cambrian who are trying to protect themselves from predators. And finally, the increase in oxygen concentrations allows for higher levels of aerobic activity, which is one way of describing predation. So predators need lots and lots and lots of oxygen. Prey need lots and lots of oxygen to escape from their predators. And the only way that can really happen is if there's lots of oxygen to go around for everybody. So that is our first big reason of why the Cambrian explosion happened at that time, is these big change in environmental conditions after the end of Snowball Earth. And we'll talk about the others in the next video. See you there.